The Tay Ninh province sits like a dagger pointed at Cambodia's heart, its northwestern border a porous membrane that bleeds war in both directions. Here, where the Vam Kodong River winds through elephant grass and triple canopy jungle, the ancient rubber plantations of French colonial ambition have become killing fields. The air hangs thick with the weight of monsoon humidity, and something older, something the Cao Dai mystics who built their Holy See temple in Tainan City understood long before American boots ever touched this red earth. February of 1970 marked the 5th year of American ground operations in Vietnam, yet the war had evolved beyond conventional metrics. Body counts and territory gained offered false comfort against an enemy that moved like smoke through tunnels carved beneath the jungle floor. The North Vietnamese Army's 95C Regiment had turned this corner of Tay Ninh into a logistics hub, funneling supplies from Cambodia along what intelligence officers clinically labeled infiltration routes. The local population knew them by older names: ghost roads, spirit paths, the highways of the restless dead. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, commanding the 1st Battalion, 27th Infantry Regiment, had arrived in country 3 months prior with orders that read like a fever dream of Pentagon strategists. Disrupt enemy psychological warfare capabilities through innovative countermeasures. His unit, officially designated as a Special Operations Psychological Warfare Detachment, carried equipment that would have seemed alien to the grunts humping the standard load of M16s and grenades through the bush. Webb's men transported something far stranger: speakers, amplifiers, magnetic tape recordings, and electronics that hummed with the peculiar voltage of experimental warfare. The villages scattered throughout Tay Ninh's jungle corridors had witnessed every permutation of violence since the French withdrawal in 1954. They had endured Viet Minh reprisals, Diem government pacification, and now the grinding attrition of American search and destroy missions. Yet the local population spoke of something else, something that moved through the night independent of politics or ideology. The villagers called them the Ma Lai, the wandering souls, spirits of those who died violent deaths away from home, denied proper burial rites, condemned to eternal restlessness. Vietnamese folklore had always treated death as a bureaucratic process requiring specific protocols. The soul needed guidance, ceremony, the burning of incense and paper money to purchase safe passage to the ancestral realm. Those denied these rites became Ma Lai, angry ghosts who haunted the living with voices that echoed through bamboo groves and rice paddies. They wailed for their mothers, called out the names of distant villages, recited fragments of prayers never completed. The war had created thousands of them: Vietnamese, American, French colonial troops whose bones had been scattered across decades of conflict. Colonel Webb's psychological warfare unit had studied these beliefs with the clinical detachment of anthropologists dissecting a primitive culture. Their mission parameters included exploitation of indigenous supernatural beliefs for tactical advantage. What they had not anticipated was the possibility that those beliefs might be rooted in something more substantial than superstition. The 6th PSYOP Battalion had been experimenting with what they termed acoustic harassment since late 1969. Standard operations involved broadcasting propaganda messages from helicopter-mounted speakers, attempting to demoralize North Vietnamese troops with promises of amnesty or threats of incoming artillery. The results had been negligible. Enemy forces either ignored the broadcasts or used them to locate and target the aircraft. Webb's unit represented a new approach: ground-based operations designed to penetrate deeper into enemy-controlled territory, using portable equipment to create what intelligence analysts called persistent psychological pressure. The jungle around Tay Ninh held its secrets close. Beneath the canopy, temperature dropped 15 degrees from the blazing heat of cleared areas, creating a microclimate of perpetual twilight. Sound behaved strangely here. Conversations carried farther than they should, while other noises seemed to vanish entirely, swallowed by the dense vegetation. Webb's men had reported audio anomalies during their first week of operations, voices speaking Vietnamese that didn't correspond to any known enemy positions, children crying from apparently empty clearings, the sound of wooden flutes playing melodies that predated the war by centuries. Local Kit Carson Scouts, former North Vietnamese soldiers who had defected to the American side, refused to discuss these phenomena directly. They would only say that the jungle held memories, and that some memories had begun to bleed through into the world of the living. The war, they claimed, had opened doors that should have remained closed. As February 14th dawned over Tay Ninh province, Webb's psychological warfare detachment prepared to begin an operation that would challenge every assumption about the nature of warfare, the power of belief, and the thin membrane separating the world of the living from whatever lay beyond. They carried with them magnetic tapes recorded in Hanoi studios, designed to simulate the voices of dead North Vietnamese soldiers calling their comrades home. What they could not have known was that something in the jungle had been waiting for exactly this invitation, something that understood the power of voices from beyond the grave far better than any Pentagon strategist ever could. Lieutenant Colonel Webb stood beside a canvas-covered deuce-and-a-half truck, watching his men load equipment that officially didn't exist. The manifests listed the cargo as communications gear and field recording apparatus, but the reality was far more sophisticated. Nestled in foam-lined cases were ANPI-Q4 directional speakers capable of projecting sound across 3 kilometers of jungle terrain, portable generators that could run silent for 18 hours, and magnetic tape players modified by technicians at Fort Bragg's classified workshops. The crown jewel of Webb's arsenal was a device the engineers had dubbed the Ghost Box, a custom-built amplification system that could layer multiple audio tracks, adjust pitch and timbre in real time, and create what psychoacoustic specialists called phantom voices, sounds that seemed to originate from inside the listener's own skull. Sergeant First Class Danny Kowalski supervised the equipment loading with the methodical precision of a man who understood that his life depended on every component functioning flawlessly. Kowalski had arrived in Vietnam with a background in broadcast engineering and a security clearance that allowed him access to files marked Eyes Only. He knew that the magnetic tapes secured in his truck's steel lockbox contained recordings made by North Vietnamese prisoners of war, men who had been convinced to speak the names of their dead comrades, to recite funeral prayers, to call out in the voices of sons asking their fathers to come home. What the prisoners hadn't known was that their voices would be electronically manipulated, pitch-shifted, and layered with subsonic frequencies designed to trigger primal fear responses in the human nervous system. The operation's scientific foundation rested on research conducted at the Army's Human Engineering Laboratory in Aberdeen, Maryland. Psychologists working under classified contracts had studied the acoustic properties of human grief, measuring the specific frequencies produced by mourning voices across different cultures. They had discovered that certain combinations of pitch, resonance, and timing could bypass conscious thought and trigger what they termed ancestral recognition patterns, evolutionary responses to distress calls that predated language itself. Vietnamese subjects, when exposed to these modified recordings in controlled laboratory conditions, had exhibited measurable increases in cortisol production, elevated heart rates, and a phenomenon researchers called auditory hallucination cascade, the tendency to hear additional voices that weren't actually present in the recordings. Webb's team consisted of 12 men drawn from psychological operations units across Southeast Asia. Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos carried the portable recording equipment, German-made Nagra tape decks that could capture audio with laboratory precision in field conditions. Corporal James Mitchell operated the directional microphones, devices sensitive enough to detect conversations at distances exceeding 500 meters. Private First Class Robert Chin, The unit's only native Vietnamese speaker served as translator and cultural advisor, though his official personnel file made no mention of his grandfather's work as a medium in Cholan spirit temples, or his childhood spent learning to distinguish between the voices of the living and the dead. The mission parameters called for Webb's detachment to establish 3 observation posts along known North Vietnamese infiltration routes, using the psychological warfare equipment to create what planners termed sonic barriers. The theory suggested that enemy forces, confronted with the voices of their dead comrades calling them to abandon their positions, would experience unit cohesion breakdown and voluntary withdrawal from the operational area. Previous experiments with conventional propaganda broadcasts had yielded minimal results, but the Pentagon's Psychological Warfare Division believed that exploiting deeply held spiritual beliefs would prove more effective than appeals to reason or ideology. Firebase Charlie occupied a cleared hilltop surrounded by concertina wire and sandbagged bunkers, its perimeter defended by a company of the 25th Infantry Division. The base commander, Major William Harrison, had received orders to provide support for Webb's operation without being briefed on its specific nature. Harrison understood only that the psychological warfare team required transportation to forward positions and secure communication links back to command headquarters. He had not been told about the magnetic tapes, the acoustic research, or the theoretical possibility that playing recordings of dead voices might produce responses from sources other than enemy soldiers. As dawn light filtered through the jungle canopy, Webb reviewed the intelligence reports that had shaped his mission planning. North Vietnamese forces in Tay Ninh operated primarily during night hours, using darkness to conceal movement along supply routes that snaked through Cambodia and into South Vietnam. Recent prisoner interrogations had revealed that enemy units maintained strict communication discipline, rarely using radio equipment that might reveal their positions to American direction-finding teams. This acoustic silence, intelligence analysts reasoned, would make the psychological impact of unexpected voices even more pronounced. The Kit Carson scout assigned to Webb's team was a former North Vietnamese Army lieutenant named Nguyen Van Duc, who had defected 6 months earlier after witnessing his entire squad killed in a B-52 bombing raid. Duc possessed intimate knowledge of enemy operating procedures and had provided detailed maps of tunnel complexes and supply caches throughout the province. Yet when briefed on the psychological warfare operation, his response had been troubling. He had warned Webb that playing the voices of the dead in jungle areas where violent deaths had occurred might attract attention from sources that had no allegiance to either side of the conflict. The American officers had dismissed these concerns as superstition, but Duc had quietly begun carrying protective amulets blessed by Buddhist monks in Tay Ninh City. At 0630 hours, Webb's convoy departed Firebase Charlie for the first equipment placement site, designated Landing Zone Whisper. The route followed Highway 22 for 3 kilometers before turning onto a dirt track that disappeared into jungle so dense that noon would feel like twilight. The lead vehicle was an M113 armored personnel carrier mounting a .50 caliber machine gun, followed by the equipment truck, a communications jeep, and a rearguard APC. Radio protocol called for complete silence except in cases of enemy contact or mechanical breakdown. The convoy moved through landscape that bore the scars of 5 years of intensive warfare. Bomb craters filled with stagnant water reflected the sky like dead eyes, while sections of forest had been stripped bare by Agent Orange defoliation. Yet life persisted in forms that seemed to mock human attempts at destruction. Vines that grew back stronger, insects that swarmed in clouds dense enough to choke aircraft engines, and sounds that echoed through the canopy with origins no intelligence report could explain. As the vehicles penetrated deeper into territory where American forces operated only during daylight hours, Sergeant Kowalski noticed that his equipment readings had begun to fluctuate. The electromagnetic field detectors, designed to locate enemy radio transmissions, were registering anomalous signatures that didn't correspond to any known communication equipment. The frequencies appeared to be natural phenomena, yet they pulsed with patterns that suggested intentional modulation. When Kowalski reported these findings to Webb, the colonel ordered him to continue monitoring, but to discuss the anomalies with no one else in the unit. By 0800 hours, the convoy had reached the coordinates for Landing Zone Whisper, a clearing created by a B-52 strike 2 weeks earlier, where shattered trees created natural concealment for electronic equipment. As Webb's men began unloading their cargo, the jungle around them seemed to respond with an almost organic attention, as if the forest itself had begun to listen. Private First Class Robert Chin crouched beside the portable seismograph, watching needle fluctuations that defied his technical training. The device was designed to detect underground movement, tunnel digging, the passage of large groups through subterranean complexes, the vibrations created by heavy equipment being moved through enemy supply routes. Instead, the seismograph was recording what appeared to be a heartbeat, a rhythmic pulse emanating from deep beneath the jungle floor with a frequency of approximately 60 beats per minute. Chin had calibrated the equipment twice, replaced the sensor array, and run diagnostic routines that confirmed perfect operational status. The jungle itself seemed to be breathing. Sergeant Kowalski had positioned the primary ghost box beneath a camouflage net strung between two bomb-shattered mahogany trees, their trunks twisted into shapes that resembled supplicating arms. The amplification system drew power from a generator buried 3 feet underground, its exhaust vented through a network of bamboo tubes that dispersed the sound across half a kilometer of jungle floor. When activated, the ghost box could project voices with enough clarity and volume to penetrate the thickest vegetation, creating the illusion that the dead were speaking from specific locations rather than from electronic equipment hidden in the forest. The magnetic tapes secured in Kowalski's equipment case contained 47 minutes of processed audio, each segment calibrated for maximum psychological impact. Track 1 featured the voice of a North Vietnamese soldier named Pham Van Minh, who had died during the siege of Khe Sanh 2 years earlier. Minh's final words, recorded by American medics who had attempted to save his life, had been processed through acoustic laboratories until his voice carried the specific resonance frequencies that Vietnamese cultural research indicated would trigger recognition responses in former comrades. The recorded voice called out in perfect Hanoi dialect, "Brothers, why do you continue fighting? The ancestors are calling us home. The war serves only to feed the hungry ghosts." Track 2 contained the processed voices of children, sons and daughters of North Vietnamese soldiers killed in action, their words carefully scripted by psychological warfare specialists who had studied Vietnamese family structures for months. The children's voices had been recorded by actors in Saigon studios, then electronically aged and modified to simulate the speech patterns of rural northern dialects. They recited traditional funeral prayers, called out the names of specific villages, and pleaded with their fathers to abandon the battlefield and join them in the ancestral realm. What made these recordings particularly unsettling was their accuracy. Intelligence gathered from prisoner interrogations had provided the actual names of dead soldiers' children, their birth villages, and fragments of lullabies sung by mothers who had not seen their husbands in years. Webb stood at the edge of Landing Zone Whisper, studying terrain maps that failed to capture the oppressive sense of observation that had settled over his unit since their arrival. According to intelligence reports, this section of Tay Ninh province had been the site of intensive combat for over a decade. French colonial forces had fought Viet Minh units through these same jungle corridors in the early 1950s, leaving behind graves that had been lost to vegetation and time. American units had conducted sweeps through the area monthly since 1968, encountering resistance that seemed to materialize from the forest floor itself. The body count statistics suggested that hundreds of men from multiple armies had died within a 5-kilometer radius of their current position, yet official records contain no information about burial sites or attempts to recover remains. Kit Carson Scout Nguyen Van Duke had been unusually quiet since the convoy's arrival at the landing zone, speaking only when directly questioned and avoiding eye contact with the American soldiers. When pressed for his assessment of enemy activity in the area, Duke had provided tactical information with professional competence, but Webb noticed that the former North Vietnamese officer kept glancing towards sections of jungle where no movement was visible. During the equipment setup, Duke had quietly approached Chen and spoken rapidly in Vietnamese, his words too soft for the monitoring equipment to record clearly. Chen's translation had been terse. He says the jungle remembers everything that dies in it, and some things that died here are still angry. The psychological profile prepared for Operation Wandering Soul had identified Vietnamese spiritual beliefs as an exploitable weakness in enemy morale, but the researchers had focused on documented religious practices rather than the deeper animistic traditions that predated Buddhism and Confucianism by millennia. Vietnamese folklore recognized categories of supernatural entities that academic studies had dismissed as primitive superstition. The Ma Lai who wandered without rest, the Ma Shet Duoi who had died violently in water, and the Kan Ma who had been murdered and sought vengeance against the living. According to traditional beliefs, these spirits could be appeased through proper ceremonies or controlled by individuals who possess the necessary spiritual knowledge. They could also be provoked by careless interference with the boundaries between life and death. Staff Sergeant Santos had begun experiencing equipment malfunctions that followed no logical pattern. His Nagra tape recorders were registering audio input when no sounds were being made, capturing what appeared to be conversations in Vietnamese that contained no voices matching those of the American team or their Kit Carson Scout. When Santos reviewed these recordings through headphones, he heard fragments of military radio chatter using call signs that had been discontinued years earlier, orders being given in French colonial dialect, and what sounded like traditional Vietnamese funeral chants being sung by voices that didn't correspond to any known enemy positions. The acoustic analysis software indicated that some of these recorded voices originated from locations underground, as if the speakers were buried beneath several feet of earth. Corporal Mitchell's directional microphones had detected similar anomalies throughout the morning. His equipment was calibrated to distinguish between human voices, animal sounds, and mechanical noise, automatically filtering background jungle ambiance to focus on potential enemy communications. Instead, the microphones were picking up what appeared to be a continuous low-frequency murmur just below the threshold of conscious perception that seemed to originate from the jungle itself. When Mitchell boosted the signal and filtered out vegetation noise, the murmur resolved into what sounded like hundreds of voices speaking simultaneously in multiple languages and dialects, creating an acoustic tapestry that no Vietnamese unit could possibly produce. The intelligence reports that had guided Operation Wandering Soul's planning contained no reference to similar phenomena observed by previous American operations in the area. Yet Webb's review of classified after-action reports revealed a pattern of unusual incidents that had been dismissed as combat stress or equipment failure. Units conducting night patrols had reported hearing Vietnamese voices calling for help from locations where no personnel were present. Radio operators had logged communication intercepts that appeared to be enemy transmissions, but contained outdated information and references to military units that had been destroyed months earlier. Medical personnel had treated soldiers who claimed to have seen North Vietnamese troops in areas that had been cleared by intensive bombing, only to have follow-up sweeps reveal no evidence of enemy presence. As noon approached, and the equatorial sun transformed the jungle canopy into a cathedral of green shadows, Webb prepared to initialize the first phase of psychological warfare operations. The Ghost Box had been tested and calibrated, the directional speakers positioned to create optimal sound projection, and the magnetic tapes loaded in sequence for automated playback. According to the mission timeline, the initial broadcast would begin at 1300 hours and continue for 6 hours, targeting known enemy rest areas, with voices designed to exploit the deepest fears and spiritual vulnerabilities of North Vietnamese soldiers. What Webb could not have anticipated was that something in the jungle had been listening to his preparations with growing interest. The acoustic anomalies detected by his equipment represented not equipment malfunction or enemy countermeasures, but the attention of entities that had been waiting decades for someone to provide them with the technology necessary to make their voices heard by the living once again. The Operation Wandering Soul team had brought exactly the tools that the dead had been hoping someone would eventually carry into their domain. At 12:55 hours, as Sergeant Kowalski's hand moved toward the activation switch for the ghost box, the jungle around Landing Zone Whisper fell into a silence so complete that it seemed to absorb sound itself, as if the entire forest was holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. The first voice that emerged from the ghost box belonged to Pham Van Minh, processed through 47 hours of acoustic manipulation, but still carrying the cadence of a man who had died calling for his mother. Sergeant Kowalski watched the output meters spike as Min's electronically resurrected voice projected across 3 kilometers of jungle canopy, his words crafted to penetrate North Vietnamese positions with surgical precision. Comrades of the 95C Regiment, this is Lieutenant Pham Van Minh, speaking from beyond the veil of death. The ancestors have shown me the futility of our struggle. Lay down your weapons and join us in the peaceful realm. The response came within 37 seconds, not from enemy positions, but from the jungle itself. Private Chen's monitoring equipment registered the anomaly first, a voice speaking perfect North Vietnamese dialect, originating from coordinates that placed the speaker approximately 15 meters directly beneath Landing Zone Whisper. The voice belonged to someone who had not been part of the original recordings, someone whose accent suggested rural origins near Dien Bien Phu, someone who had been dead for considerably longer than 2 years. The underground voice spoke with the authority of a senior officer. Brother Min, you speak through the machines of the invaders. We have been waiting for you to show us how to use their devices. We have much to say to those who still walk above the earth. Staff Sergeant Santos grabbed his headphones as his Nagra tape deck began recording input from sources that his equipment specifications insisted were impossible. The voices multiplying through his monitoring system weren't coming from radio transmissions or acoustic projection. They were emerging directly from the magnetic recording heads, as if the tape itself had become a conduit for communication from some parallel frequency spectrum. Santos heard French voices speaking in the clipped tones of colonial military officers, their words mixing with Vietnamese funeral chants and what sounded like American soldiers reciting serial numbers, and hometowns and voices that carried the hollow resonance of men speaking from underwater. Lieutenant Colonel Webb grabbed the radio handset to report the anomalous activity to Firebase Charlie, but discovered that his communication equipment was now broadcasting voices that weren't being transmitted by anyone in his unit. The radio frequency assigned to Operation Wandering Soul was carrying conversations between dead soldiers from multiple conflicts, their words creating a cacophony of overlapping languages and dialects that spanned decades of warfare. French officers were calling out map coordinates for artillery strikes against targets that had been obliterated in 1954. American pilots were requesting air support for landing zones that had been overrun in 1968. North Vietnamese soldiers were singing revolutionary songs while reciting the names of villages that had been depopulated by chemical defoliation. Corporal Mitchell's directional microphones were tracking movement through the jungle that followed no pattern consistent with living human beings. His acoustic triangulation equipment indicated that dozens of individuals were approaching Landing Zone Whisper from multiple directions, yet their movement generated no sound of footsteps on vegetation, no rustle of equipment, no audible breathing or conversation. The approaching signatures moved with perfect coordination, as if controlled by a single intelligence, and their estimated speed suggested that they were covering ground at rates impossible for humans burdened with military equipment. Kit Carson Scout Nguyen Van Duke had positioned himself at the perimeter of the equipment area, his AK-47 held in a ready position that suggested he was prepared to defend against threats that couldn't be countered with conventional weapons. When Webb approached him for tactical assessment, Duke's response was delivered in English carefully chosen for clarity. "Colonel, we have opened a door that should have remained closed. The voices you are broadcasting, they are being answered by those who have been waiting decades for someone to provide them with the means to speak. They are not our enemies or your enemies. They are angry at everyone who still lives while they remain trapped between worlds." The Ghost Box, designed to project psychological warfare recordings according to predetermined schedules, had begun operating independently of its programming. Kowalski's attempts to regain control of the system were unsuccessful. The device was now broadcasting voices that weren't contained on any of the magnetic tapes loaded into its playback mechanism. The electronically enhanced voice of Pham Van Minh had been joined by what appeared to be his entire deceased unit, soldiers who were providing real-time intelligence about current North Vietnamese positions, American patrol schedules, and planned operations that hadn't been shared with any captured personnel. More disturbing was the accuracy of their information. The dead voices were describing enemy tunnel complexes with precision that exceeded Webb's classified intelligence reports, identifying weapon caches that American forces hadn't discovered, and reciting the names and ranks of North Vietnamese officers who were supposedly operating under false identities. When the voices began discussing American personnel movements and firebase, Charlie's defensive preparations, Webb realized that the dead possessed intelligence capabilities that transcended the limitations of living reconnaissance. Private Chin had abandoned his seismograph monitoring station after the equipment began registering what appeared to be large numbers of individuals moving through underground passages that didn't correspond to any mapped tunnel system. The seismic signatures suggested organized movement by hundreds of entities, all converging on Landing Zone Whisper from tunnels that extended far beyond the known enemy excavations. Some of the signatures were originating from depths that would place them below the water table, in spaces where tunnel construction should have been impossible due to flooding and geological instability. At 13:47 hours, the first visual confirmation of the anomalous activity occurred when Staff Sergeant Santos observed what appeared to be a North Vietnamese soldier standing at the edge of the clearing, approximately 50 meters from the equipment position. The figure was clearly visible through binoculars, a young man wearing the standard NVA uniform and equipment load of someone who had died during the early phases of American involvement. What made the sighting impossible was that Santos could see through the soldier's body to the vegetation beyond, as if the figure was composed of translucent material that barely affected the passage of light. The translucent soldier was soon joined by others, French colonial troops in khaki uniforms that had been discontinued before most of Webb's unit had been born, American soldiers wearing equipment configurations from units that had been rotated home years earlier, and Vietnamese fighters whose black pajama uniforms and sandals suggested allegiance to movements that predated the current conflict by decades. They stood in formation at the perimeter of Landing Zone Whisper, maintaining military discipline while observing the psychological warfare equipment with what appeared to be professional interest rather than hostility. Sergeant Kowalski discovered that the Ghost Box was now responding to voice commands that weren't being issued by anyone in the American team. When one of the translucent figures gestured toward the speaker array, the volume increased. When another raised his hand, the frequency modulation shifted to enhance the clarity of Vietnamese dialect transmissions. The dead had taken operational control of the psychological warfare equipment and were using it to coordinate activities that extended far beyond the immediate area around Landing Zone Whisper. Webb's attempts to contact Firebase Charlie for emergency extraction had been unsuccessful due to radio interference that appeared to be intentionally generated by the anomalous entities. Every frequency his communications specialist tried was being jammed by what sounded like military radio traffic from multiple historical periods, creating an electromagnetic cacophony that prevented transmission of emergency signals. The dead had effectively isolated Webb's unit from external support while they completed whatever process had been initiated by the activation of the psychological warfare equipment. At 14:23 hours, the voices emerging from the ghost box began speaking directly to the American soldiers by name, demonstrating knowledge of personal information that hadn't been shared with anyone in the operational area. The dead knew Webb's hometown in Ohio, Kowalski's concerns about his pregnant wife, Santos's recurring nightmares about a helicopter crash he had witnessed 6 months earlier. They spoke with the familiarity of comrades who had served together for years, yet their voices carried the hollow resonance of men speaking from the bottom of a well filled with dark water. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across Landing Zone Whisper, Webb realized that Operation Wandering Soul had achieved success beyond his most optimistic projections, but not in any way that military strategists had anticipated. The psychological warfare equipment had indeed made contact with the dead, establishing communication with entities that possessed intelligence capabilities far exceeding those of living combatants. The problem was that the dead had their own agenda, and it involved using Webb's technology to settle accounts that had been accumulating interest for decades of unresolved warfare. The Ghost Box had become something beyond its original design parameters, a portal that connected the world of the living with decades of accumulated warfare dead. What emerged from the speakers was no longer psychological warfare, but a military briefing conducted by officers who had been killed in action across multiple conflicts, their voices layering into a strategic discussion that spanned French colonial operations, American counterinsurgency tactics, and North Vietnamese guerrilla strategies. The dead were comparing notes, sharing intelligence that had been lost with their deaths, and coordinating activities that transcended the political divisions that had separated them in life. Private Chen watched his monitoring equipment track movement that defied every law of physics he understood. The seismograph was now registering what appeared to be mechanized units moving through underground spaces, the acoustic signatures of tanks, artillery pieces, and troop transport vehicles traveling through tunnels that couldn't possibly accommodate such equipment. When Chen cross-referenced the seismic data with historical battle records, he realized that the underground movements corresponded exactly to the positions held by armored units during specific engagements that had occurred years earlier. The dead were refighting their wars, but with perfect knowledge of enemy positions and tactical advantages that living commanders had never possessed. Staff Sergeant Santos had abandoned any attempt to control his recording equipment after discovering that the magnetic tapes were now playing content that had never been recorded. His Nagra deck was reproducing conversations between dead French officers and Vietnamese revolutionaries who had killed each other during the siege of Dien Bien Phu. Their discussions focused on tactical errors that had led to mutual destruction. The voices spoke with the detached professionalism of men analyzing operations from a perspective that only death could provide, identifying mistakes that could have prevented their deaths if they had possessed the benefit of hindsight during their final battles. Lieutenant Colonel Webb found himself facing a situation that no military academy had prepared him to handle. The translucent figures surrounding Landing Zone Whisper had organized themselves into a formation that combined elements from multiple armies and historical periods. French colonial officers stood alongside North Vietnamese regulars, American infantry shared positions with Viet Minh guerrillas, and Kit Carson scouts maintained formation with soldiers they had killed during previous engagements. The dead had achieved the unity in death that had been impossible during their lives, creating a mixed unit that operated with perfect coordination despite representing opposing sides of three separate conflicts. The conversation emerging from the Ghost Box had evolved into something resembling a war crimes tribunal conducted by the victims themselves. The dead were methodically reviewing decisions made by living commanders, identifying orders that had led to unnecessary casualties, and discussing the responsibility borne by officers who had survived battles that claimed their subordinates. French colonial administrators were being questioned about policies that had triggered the initial insurgency. American generals were being examined regarding tactical doctrines that had maximized body counts while failing to achieve strategic objectives. North Vietnamese leaders were being held accountable for decisions that had condemned their own troops to unwinnable battles for purely political purposes. Sergeant Kowalski discovered that the Ghost Box was now transmitting these proceedings across every radio frequency used by military forces throughout Southeast Asia. The psychological warfare equipment had become a broadcast station operated by the dead, reaching every American firebase, North Vietnamese command post, and Allied installation within a radius of several hundred kilometers. Living soldiers on both sides of the conflict were hearing detailed discussions of command failures, tactical mistakes, and strategic miscalculations delivered by officers who had paid for these errors with their lives. The effect on living troops was immediate and devastating. Radio operators at Firebase Charlie reported that American soldiers were laying down their weapons after hearing dead comrades describe the futility of operations that had led to their deaths. North Vietnamese units were abandoning prepared positions after listening to fallen commanders explain how their sacrifice had served political purposes rather than military objectives. Allied forces throughout the region were experiencing what intelligence analysts would later classify as spontaneous unit cohesion breakdown, as living soldiers confronted the testimony of the dead regarding the true cost of continuing the conflict. Kit Carson scout Nguyen Van Duke had positioned himself at the center of the equipment area, his weapon lowered in a gesture that suggested surrender to forces beyond conventional military authority. When Webb demanded an explanation for his abandonment of defensive posture, Duke's response carried the weight of cultural understanding that transcended military training. "Colonel, these are not enemy soldiers. These are the teachers who have been waiting for students willing to learn from their sacrifice. They are showing us that the war we think we're fighting ended years ago. What continues now serves only to create more teachers for lessons that no one wants to learn." The translucent figures had begun interacting directly with Webb's living soldiers, engaging in conversations that violated every security protocol regarding contact with enemy personnel. French officers were comparing equipment configurations with American soldiers, sharing technical knowledge about jungle warfare that had been developed through decades of trial and error. North Vietnamese soldiers were discussing tactical innovations with their former enemies, explaining guerrilla strategies that living American commanders had never fully understood. The dead were conducting the military education that should have occurred between professional soldiers if political considerations hadn't transformed them into enemies. Corporal Mitchell's directional microphones were tracking conversations that extended far beyond landing zone whisper, connecting the equipment area with voices originating from locations throughout Tay Ninh province and beyond. The dead were using Webb's psychological warfare equipment as a communication network that linked every battlefield where soldiers had died without resolution, creating a conference call that included participants from conflicts spanning the entire history of warfare in Southeast Asia. The Ghost Box had become a telephone exchange operated by entities who possessed perfect intelligence about military operations because they had died participating in them. At 1612 hours, the nature of the manifestation shifted from military briefing to active intervention in ongoing combat operations. The voices emerging from the ghost box began providing real-time tactical guidance to living soldiers engaged in firefights throughout the operational area. Dead officers were calling out enemy positions to their former subordinates, identifying ambush sites, and coordinating suppressive fire with the precision that only perfect battlefield awareness could provide. Living American soldiers were receiving support from dead North Vietnamese advisors, while surviving enemy troops were being guided by fallen American commanders who understood their tactical situation better than their living officers. The boundaries between friend and enemy had dissolved under the authority of the dead, who recognized only the distinction between those who continued to perpetuate unnecessary killing and those who possessed the wisdom to end it. Webb watched through binoculars as living soldiers from opposing forces began meeting at predetermined coordinates, guided by dead officers who directed them to locations where weapons could be abandoned and survival could be negotiated without further loss of life. Private Chin's equipment registered the approach of mechanized units that shouldn't have existed, the acoustic signatures of French armored columns that had been destroyed at Dien Bien Phu, American air mobile units that had been shot down over Cambodia, and North Vietnamese tank formations that had been eliminated by B-52 strikes. The dead were bringing their equipment with them, reconstituting military units with vehicles and weapons that existed in whatever dimension they inhabited, preparing for operations that living commanders couldn't comprehend. At 16:47 hours, the ghost box transmitted a message that was clearly directed at the highest levels of military command on all sides of the conflict. The voice belonged to a French general who had died during the final assault on Dien Bien Phu, his words carrying the authority of someone who had learned the ultimate cost of military miscalculation. Attention all living commanders currently engaged in operations throughout Southeast Asia. You are hereby ordered to cease hostilities and withdraw your forces to defensive positions. This order is issued by the collective authority of all soldiers who have died in service to your strategic objectives. We have reviewed your tactical performance and found it inadequate to justify further expenditure of human life. Compliance is not optional. Webb realized that Operation Wandering Soul had achieved something unprecedented in the history of warfare. It had established communication with an enemy that possessed absolute moral authority, perfect intelligence, and the ability to influence combat operations across the entire theater of conflict. The dead had declared their own war against the continuation of violence that served no purpose beyond creating more dead soldiers to join their ranks. Webb's psychological warfare team had become witnesses to a military coup conducted by entities who had earned the right to determine when enough killing was enough. The withdrawal of the supernatural forces occurred with the same military precision that had characterized their intervention, but in reverse. One by one, the translucent figures faded from view, their forms becoming increasingly transparent until only the faintest impressions remained visible against the jungle backdrop. The ghost box continued broadcasting for exactly 17 minutes after the last visual confirmation of paranormal activity, then fell silent with the mechanical finality of equipment that had completed its programmed mission. When Sergeant Kowalski examined the device, he discovered that every magnetic tape had been completely erased, leaving only blank reels that bore no trace of the psychological warfare recordings they had originally contained. Private Chin's monitoring equipment registered the departure as a series of seismic events that suggested massive underground movement in the direction of Cambodia, as if entire armies were withdrawing through subterranean passages that connected every battlefield in Southeast Asia. The acoustic signatures indicated organized retreat by mechanized units that left no physical evidence of their passage, moving through geological formations that couldn't possibly support the passage of heavy military equipment. Within 30 minutes of the manifestation's end, Chin's instruments detected no anomalous activity, returning to baseline readings that suggested the jungle had returned to its normal state of ecological balance. Staff Sergeant Santos reviewed the magnetic tapes produced by his Nagra recording equipment during the supernatural engagement, discovering that most contained only electromagnetic noise, punctuated by brief segments of intelligible audio. The segments that remained audible featured conversations between individuals who couldn't be identified through voice recognition analysis, speaking in dialects that linguistic specialists would later classify as archaic Vietnamese with French colonial influences and American English with regional variations from multiple geographical areas. The recordings provided no tactical intelligence about enemy positions or capabilities, containing instead what appeared to be fragments of philosophical discussions about the nature of duty, sacrifice, and the responsibility of the living to honor the intentions of the dead. Lieutenant Colonel Webb attempted to re-establish communication with Firebase Charlie, discovering that radio frequencies throughout the region were gradually returning to normal operational parameters. The first successful contact came at 1923 hours, when Webb's communications specialist reached Major Harrison's command post and received orders to abort Operation Wandering Soul and return immediately for debriefing. Harrison's transmission was brief and carried undertones that suggested higher command levels were already aware that the psychological warfare operation had produced results far beyond its original scope. The return journey to Firebase, Charlie revealed that Webb's unit had not been the only military formation affected by the supernatural intervention. Highway 22 was crowded with convoys moving in both directions, carrying soldiers whose expressions suggested they had experienced events that challenged their understanding of warfare itself. American troops were being evacuated from forward positions that had been abandoned without enemy contact, while intelligence reports indicated that North Vietnamese units had simultaneously withdrawn from prepared defensive positions, leaving behind equipment and supplies that suggested planned rather than tactical retreat. Kit Carson Scout Nguyen Von Duke provided the most coherent assessment of what had occurred during the manifestation, explaining that Webb's psychological warfare equipment had successfully established communication with entities that Vietnamese spiritual tradition recognized as legitimate military authority. According to Duke's interpretation, the dead soldiers had used the ghost box to conduct what amounted to a formal military review of ongoing operations, concluding that the conflict had devolved into purposeless killing that dishonored the sacrifices of those who had died with specific strategic objectives. The supernatural intervention represented not enemy action, but corrective measures taken by fallen soldiers who retained responsibility for the living troops under their ultimate command. Debriefing sessions conducted at Firebase Charlie over the following 72 hours revealed that similar anomalous events had occurred throughout the Tay Ninh province operational area. Multiple American units reported contact with translucent figures wearing military uniforms from various historical periods, all of whom had provided tactical guidance that led to successful disengagement from potential combat situations. North Vietnamese prisoners captured during subsequent operations reported that their units had received similar supernatural guidance, with dead officers directing living soldiers to avoid engagements that would result in unnecessary casualties. Medical personnel treating soldiers who had experienced direct contact with the supernatural entities found no evidence of psychological trauma or combat stress reactions. Instead, the affected individuals demonstrated what psychiatrists classified as abnormal clarity regarding the strategic context of their mission assignments, expressing concerns about the purpose of specific operations that had previously been accepted without question. Many requested reassignment to non-combat roles, citing conversations with dead comrades who had convinced them that their deaths would serve no strategic purpose worthy of the sacrifice. Intelligence analysis of the Operation Wandering Soul incident focused on the tactical implications of the supernatural intervention rather than its metaphysical significance. Classification levels assigned to the debriefing reports suggested that higher command authorities were treating the manifestation as a potential enemy capability rather than a paranormal phenomenon, with particular attention focused on the accuracy of intelligence possessed by the supernatural entities. The dead had demonstrated knowledge of classified operations, personnel movements, and strategic planning that exceeded the capabilities of conventional intelligence gathering, raising concerns about the security implications of their continued presence in the operational area. Sergeant Kowalski's technical analysis of the ghost box revealed that the device had been physically modified during the supernatural engagement in ways that current engineering knowledge couldn't explain. Internal components showed evidence of molecular-level alterations that enhanced the equipment's capabilities beyond its original design specifications, yet these modifications couldn't be reproduced using available technology. The device continued to function normally when tested with conventional audio equipment, but attempts to operate it using psychological warfare recordings resulted in electromagnetic interference that prevented proper signal transmission. Private Chin submitted a separate report documenting his observation that the seismic activity detected during the manifestation had created new underground passages that didn't appear on any geological survey of the area. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a network of tunnels extending in multiple directions from Landing Zone Whisper, connecting with existing North Vietnamese excavations, but extending far beyond their documented scope. The tunnels showed no evidence of recent construction, yet they contained acoustic properties that suggested they had been specifically designed to carry sound across vast distances with minimal distortion. The official after-action report classified Operation Wandering Soul as partially successful in achieving its psychological warfare objectives, noting that enemy forces had withdrawn from multiple positions without direct confrontation. The report made no mention of supernatural activity, attributing the operation's effectiveness to innovative application of acoustic psychological pressure combined with exploitation of indigenous cultural beliefs regarding mortality and spiritual continuation. Recommendations for future operations included expanded research into Vietnamese folkloric traditions and development of enhanced audio projection capabilities for use in similar terrain. Webb received orders transferring him to a classified research facility in the United States, where his expertise in psychological warfare applications would contribute to projects that officially didn't exist. His final report on Operation Wandering Soul concluded with a recommendation that future psychological operations should consider the possibility that some indigenous spiritual beliefs might be based on phenomena that exceeded current scientific understanding, requiring tactical approaches that acknowledged rather than merely exploited these cultural factors. The ghost box was shipped to Fort Detrick for technical analysis under classification levels that prevented discussion of its origins or capabilities. The device disappeared from official records 3 weeks after its arrival, though research into acoustic psychological warfare continued under programs that made no reference to supernatural manifestations or communication with deceased military personnel. The lessons learned from Operation Wandering Soul were incorporated into training manuals that focused on the psychological impact of exploiting enemy spiritual beliefs, while carefully avoiding any suggestion that those beliefs might possess objective validity beyond their tactical utility. The Freedom of Information Act request, filed by Dr. Sarah Chin, granddaughter of Private First Class Robert Chin, had spent 18 months working its way through bureaucratic channels before reaching the desk of CIA Historical Review Panel Senior Analyst David Morrison. The request was specific: any documents related to psychological warfare operations conducted by the 1st Battalion, 27th Infantry Regiment in Tay Ninh Province during February 1970. What Morrison discovered in the classified archives was a file system that had been designed to obscure rather than preserve historical record, with Operation Wandering Soul referenced only through indirect notation in documents that treated it as a footnote to more conventional military activities. The official documentation that survived declassification review painted Operation Wandering Soul as a limited-scope experiment in acoustic psychological warfare that had achieved marginal tactical success before being discontinued due to equipment limitations. The reports made no mention of supernatural manifestations, focusing instead on the technical challenges of projecting recorded voices through jungle terrain and the minimal impact these broadcasts had on enemy morale. Casualty figures for the operation were listed as 0 KIA, 0 WIA, with mission duration noted as terminated after initial phase due to equipment malfunction. What the sanitized reports couldn't explain was the pattern of correlating events that had occurred throughout Southeast Asia during the weeks following Operation Wandering Soul. Military historians studying the final phase of American involvement in Vietnam had identified February 1970 as a turning point when combat intensity decreased dramatically across multiple operational areas, with both American and North Vietnamese forces demonstrating what analysts termed unusual reluctance to engage in large-scale confrontational operations. The phenomenon had been attributed to war weariness and shifting political priorities, but declassified documents revealed that the tactical changes had been implemented simultaneously by military commanders who had no direct communication with each other. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb had been transferred to the Army Research and Development Command at Fort Detrick immediately following his return from Vietnam, where he had spent the remainder of his military career working on classified projects that left no public record of their objectives or conclusions. Webb's personnel file contained commendations for innovative contributions to strategic psychological research and development of advanced acoustic countermeasures, but provided no details about the nature of his work or its applications. He had died in 1994 without ever speaking publicly about Operation Wandering Soul, taking his knowledge of the supernatural intervention to a grave in Arlington National Cemetery that bore only standard military honors. The members of Webb's psychological warfare team had been dispersed to assignments that effectively prevented them from comparing their experiences or discussing the events they had witnessed. Sergeant Kowalski had been transferred to a signals intelligence unit in Germany, where he had worked on electronic surveillance projects until his retirement in 1976. Staff Sergeant Santos had been reassigned to training duties at Fort Bragg, spending his remaining service years teaching conventional psychological operations to soldiers who would never receive briefings on acoustic anomalies or supernatural manifestations. Private Chin had completed his tour in Vietnam without further assignment to experimental units, returning to civilian life with security clearances that prohibited discussion of his military service for 25 years after his discharge. Kit Carson Scout Nguyen Van Duke had disappeared from official records immediately following Operation Wandering Soul, with his personnel file noting only that he had been transferred to alternative assignment pending security review. Intelligence analysts who attempted to trace his subsequent activities found no documentation of his presence in any refugee resettlement program, prison facility, or military unit operating in Southeast Asia after February 1970. Duke had vanished as completely as if he had joined the supernatural entities that had commandeered Webb's psychological warfare equipment, leaving behind no evidence of his existence beyond the classified reports that recorded his warnings about the consequences of disturbing the jungle's accumulated dead. The ghost box itself had been subjected to technical analysis at multiple classified research facilities before being transferred to what archived documents described as long-term storage pending future research applications. The device had been examined by engineers from Bell Laboratories, IBM, and defense contractors whose names had been redacted from all surviving documentation. Their reports, heavily censored before declassification, indicated that the equipment had been modified during Operation Wandering Soul in ways that exceeded contemporary understanding of acoustic engineering and electronic signal processing. Attempts to reverse engineer these modifications had been unsuccessful, leading to recommendations that the device be preserved for analysis using future technological capabilities currently under development. Vietnamese folklore had incorporated the events of February 1970 into oral traditions that spread throughout Southeast Asian diaspora communities in ways that government monitoring could never completely track. The stories told by refugees and immigrants described a brief period when the Ema Lai had spoken with one voice, using the machines of foreign armies to demand an end to the killing that prevented them from finding peace in the ancestral realm. According to these accounts, the wandering souls had succeeded in their intervention, convincing enough living soldiers to abandon their weapons that the war's intensity had permanently diminished, though the political structures that perpetuated the conflict had required years of additional pressure before finally acknowledging the futility of continued military engagement. Academic researchers studying Vietnamese spiritual traditions had documented variations of the ghost war narrative in refugee communities across multiple countries, with remarkable consistency in details that suggested shared historical experience rather than folklore evolution. The stories described American soldiers who had learned to hear the voices of the dead, French officers who had provided tactical guidance from beyond the grave, and North Vietnamese troops who had abandoned prepared positions after receiving orders from commanders who had died years earlier. These accounts were dismissed by historians as psychological coping mechanisms for trauma, yet the internal consistency of supernatural details across geographically separated communities suggested a source more substantial than collective imagination. Dr. Morrison's review of the declassified Operation Wandering Soul documents revealed a pattern of institutional amnesia that extended far beyond normal classification protocols. The operation had been systematically erased from official military history, with references removed from unit records, equipment inventories, and personnel files in ways that suggested coordinated suppression rather than routine security measures. The few surviving documents had been preserved only because they were embedded in larger files that couldn't be completely redacted without compromising unrelated operations that remained classified at higher levels. The most significant discovery in Morrison's research was a memorandum dated 23 February 1970, addressed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff from the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence. The document, heavily censored but still partially legible, recommended immediate termination of all research projects involving exploitation of indigenous spiritual beliefs for tactical advantage and comprehensive review of psychological warfare methodologies to eliminate approaches that might produce results exceeding operational control parameters. The memorandum suggested that Operation Wandering Soul had achieved effects that posed strategic risks to command authority and unit cohesion that outweighed any tactical advantages gained through supernatural intervention. Contemporary military psychological operations continued to employ acoustic harassment and propaganda broadcasting, but avoided any methodologies that might establish actual communication with entities beyond conventional enemy forces. Training manuals emphasized the importance of maintaining clear distinction between exploiting enemy superstitions and acknowledging the potential validity of supernatural phenomena, with specific warnings against experimental approaches that hadn't been thoroughly tested under controlled laboratory conditions. The jungle around Tay Ninh province had been transformed by decades of peace following the American withdrawal from Vietnam, with nature reclaiming landing zone whisper until no trace remained of the equipment that had briefly connected the world of the living with the accumulated wisdom of the war dead. Vietnamese tourists who visited the area occasionally reported hearing voices speaking in multiple languages during early morning hours, but these accounts were attributed to acoustic effects created by wind moving through the forest canopy rather than manifestations of supernatural activity. Dr. Sarah Chen's Freedom of Information Act request had been motivated by family stories about her grandfather's military service, particularly his claims that he had witnessed events in Vietnam that challenged his understanding of the relationship between life and death. Private Chin had told his family that he had learned to hear the voices of soldiers who had died far from home, and that these voices had taught him that some forms of service extended beyond the boundaries of mortality. His granddaughter's research represented an attempt to verify these family narratives through official documentation, though the declassified records provided only fragments of the story her grandfather had carried with him until his death in 2003. The final entry in Morrison's declassification review noted that Operation Wandering Soul had been referenced in a classified appendix to the Army's official history of psychological operations in Vietnam, but that this appendix had been removed from all copies of the document and transferred to archives that required security clearances exceeding Morrison's authorization level. The operation's true legacy existed only in scattered memories, fragmented documents, and folklore traditions that preserved essential truths while concealing the operational details that might enable replication of its unprecedented success in establishing communication between the living and the dead.